mile deep. And so we've seen a number of different impacts that are very unusual.
And people think about bringing water to these communities, but sanitation is often an afterthought. And as a result, you get these secondary waves of disease outbreak.
But what we're seeing today is a division in the country, not over an issue, but over partisanship. And both the parties have become much more ideological.
Hello and welcome to University Beat. I'm Denise White. A little more than 6 years ago, on April 20th, 2010, an explosion and fire aboard the Deepwater Horizon oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico set off what some people have called the worst environmental disaster in U.S. history. 11 workers died. 2 days later, the rig sinks and a slick appears on the water as oil spews from the uncapped wellhead. It'll take nearly 3 months to stop the flow. The accident becomes known as the BP oil spill. The federal government estimates more than 4 million barrels of oil spilled into the Gulf, although BP claims the amount is much lower. Eventually, a federal judge rules BP is responsible for spilling a little more than 3 million barrels. The damage to the Gulf and its inhabitants is still being measured. Among the people trying to determine the damage then and now are students and faculty at the College of Marine Science at USF St. Petersburg. Dr. Steve Murawski is a fisheries biologist and marine ecologist and an endowed chair professor of USF St. Pete. He is one of the nation's leading researchers into the BP spill. And Dr. Murawski joins us today. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you.
First of all, tell me how you became involved in this.
Well, my history is a little bit different than most faculty. Actually, during the spill, I was working for NOAA, which is a federal agency that was involved in oil spill response. And one of the first things we did was actually contact the University of South Florida and see if they could mobilize their ship and students and faculty to come out and start collecting information. And so after the spill was over, I talked to President Genshaft and the then Dean Bill Hogarth, and they asked me if I would be interested in coming and working at the faculty and certainly being part of the university. And so I've continued my studies of Deepwater Horizon from that.
What have you found now, since you've been doing this research, about the impact then and now?
Well, the impacts extend far and beyond what normally you would consider an oil spill. In this particular case, the oil spill was a mile deep. And so we've seen a number of different impacts that are very unusual as far as oil spill goes. Currently, we estimate that about 10% of the oil that came out of that hole rests at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico a mile deep. And it probably is going to stay there for a very long time. And then, of course, the real impacts that people care about are the impacts on biota, and that is fishes, mammals, sea turtles, and then part of that oil made its way into the salt marshes of Louisiana and Mississippi, and so some of that oil is there as well, and so it's impacting on a continuing basis a number of different ecosystems in the Gulf.
We're looking at permanent damage to the food chain as well, right? Emanating from that area.
Certainly there's a lot of interaction with the deep water in terms of different types of animals and plants that live there. And one of the ways we're trying to actually make projections about what's going to happen in the future is there was also a blowout back in 1979 and 80 in Mexico. And so we've taken our ship this past year down to Mexico to look for traces of that oil spill that happened 37 years ago. And we're able to find it buried on the bottom the same way we find it in Deepwater Horizon. So that gives us a hint that this is going to be around with us for decades.
So what's your recommendations on what to do, how to minimize the impact going forward, how to speed up the cleanup of the area?
Well, the best thing to do is to prevent it in the first place. I mean, in terms of the cleanup of the oil, it's pretty much over. It's very difficult, in fact impossible, to clean the oil out of marshes without doing more damage to those marshes than just letting it weather. And the oil at the bottom of the ocean, we would create more environmental damage trying to mine that oil up as opposed to just let it be buried by natural processes.
What do you think we still don't know about the impact of this spill in the Gulf?
Well, just like Exxon Valdez, it took a number of years for the full impacts to reveal themselves. In that case, 4 or 5 years before the herring population, which supported that ecosystem, collapsed. And so we are on the lookout for these kinds of surprises. And it's only going to take time for us to monitor these issues to make sure that some of these unforeseen things don't pop up. Almost all the researchers that you talk to in the Gulf say that we didn't have good baseline data for what was happening in the Gulf the day before the oil spill. We really have to make that right.
Well, what difference would baseline data have made?
Well, the question in the Gulf is that there's a lot of oil and hydrocarbons in the Gulf. There are natural seeps that slowly because you're sitting over a huge oil pool. So there's natural seeps that bring oil up into the water. And so if you're an oil company, you can basically say, look, it's an oily Gulf anyway. Our stuff is not contributing significantly to an oil pollution problem. It's just part of what's there. But if you have good baseline, you can separate what the impacts of a spill are from all the background that is certainly out there. And that helps in assessing blame, which means also fines, those kinds of things. And it basically says when you're done with your drilling activity, put the environment back to where it was when you started.
What have we learned from this?
With tragedy comes some sense of trying to put things right. USF has been in a leadership role, for the past 6 years in terms of doing science related to oil spill and coming up with new technologies and new approaches to try to understand this. The USF people were the first to discover large quantities of oil at the bottom of the ocean. We and our collaborators have come up with new methods to try to look at impacts on the deep sea critters that live in the bottom, and also doing high pressure studies. We've also monitored the fish populations to look at contamination. So it's been a tremendous opportunity for the university to make a contribution in something that's really societally important. And so now I think when people think about where are the schools that you can get a good education in terms of trying to understand the environmental impacts of oil, USF is at the top of that list.
Dr. Murawski, thank you so much for joining us on University Beat.
A pleasure, thank you.
If there's a story about the University of South Florida you'd like to see us cover, please let us know. Our email is ubeat@wusf.org. Our website is universitybeattv.org. We are also on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can find us by searching University Beat TV. And that's another edition of University Beat. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Denise White.